My name is Crystal Simeoni. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I serve as the executive director of NAWI, which is a collective that works on macroeconomic knowledge and narratives. Really happy to be here. I identify as a feminist Pan-African. I'm based in Nairobi, like I said, and in my spare time, I like to garden, which is filling my soul currently. That's just a little bit of me, but it's really, really great to be here amongst everyone. And it brings me such immense joy to welcome you all to this space. We're here today, and it's such a vibrant tapestry of women from such diverse threads of experiences, of work, of engagement from all corners of this continent, where it really shows that our African feminism thrives in the everyday triumphs, but also in the challenges of both our lives and our work. African feminist theory and praxis isn't really an imported concept, and we know this. It's a vibrant pulse of our history, a philosophy rooted in the strength and collective work that has sustained our communities and continues to sustain our communities from generations past, and definitely will be doing so for generations going forward. And so today we gather to have honest conversations rooted in care as we really open up a dialogue on what solidarity and care looks like in the ways that we work, in the ways that we negotiate space and power, and in the ways that we push for change that will include all of us. And so to start us off, I will invite Dina to introduce herself along the 3 Ps. Dina, please tell us who you are politically, professionally, and who you are as a person, really. And I invite you to take us through a little bit of a setting of the context as you till the soil for us to grow this conversation and what grew the strategy that Fadzai will take us through. So Dina.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Crystal. Hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to see all of you and to just acknowledge you from wherever you're joining in. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Dina Nabwire. Personally, I love walking, really nature walks in places that are green with water, flowers, those places. Yeah. I am the programs manager for nurturing and community at AWDF. What was the other one?
What is your political ideology? What do you associate with? Who are you politically?
Perfect. I identify as an African feminist. I use she, her pronouns. I am from Uganda. I mentioned that country because it's a country with so many journeys for people that identify as African feminists. And yeah, I will move into the other part of the conversation, Crystal, about the strategy and, you know, how we're here. So AWDF launched our 10-year framework last year in July at Women Deliver, for those who were there. I think it's no longer like very new news about the AWDF strategy, but it's also a bit new news for people that haven't encountered it at all. So it's really a pleasure to introduce you to Lemlem. I think that for purposes of this conversation, which is really centered on reflections around solidarity and care, one of the things that I would love to highlight around the AWDF's 10-year framework that we are working with is founded in the ways in which the strategy was, you know, co-created. And there were different processes. But one that I would love to highlight is also that we had an opportunity as part of the strategy to document AWDF's 21-year journey leading into where we were last year. And one of the things that were critical that stood out for me in regards to solidarity and care was around how we think about movements and how we come to, you know, define movements and African feminist movements and women's rights movements. And one of those things was speaking to some of the people that, you know, have been part of the AWDF journey, continually grounding us in who we are, where we have come from, and where we're going, and really drawing the emphasis on the fact that movements organically form and that we are not building them. and that movements in so many ways have existed without funding from funders like that. And movements continue to evolve and to exist even without funding, which for us at AWDF is central, because then increasingly it's about continually reflecting on how do we hold that space, recognizing that movements are actually the indispensable, that they've been here, they have organically formed out of struggles, they have resisted, and they're here, and we're to learn from them in different ways, and for us to be able to enrich our offerings. And building on this kind of understanding within the program's portfolio at AWDF, there are ways in which we have thought about the work that we're putting out as an organization. And one of those is through asking ourselves, how do we resource movements and entities that form movements to continue to be self-determining? And it draws from that I spoke about around the fact that they organically form. So we haven't formed them in a way. We haven't, like, well, none of us is like, oh, I'm, bringing all of this money to form this. That movements are already there and doing this work, and they know how to, and they have their own resources that they're drawing on. And so for us to be able to resource self-determination, to be able to think critically about this thing that we say centering movements. And in other ways for us to think about what it means to reflect on knowledge and voice when it comes to amplifying and centering movements. What does it mean? That at the end of the day, how do we ensure that with the money, we're like, we're funding movements. And then with the narratives, we're like, actually the voice is with us, something like that. So for us to be able to continually reflect on those kinds of angles. And the most relevant one for this conversation is around thinking about wellness, thinking about care, thinking about well-being holistically for and within movements, and thinking about ways in which we utilize the positions and the power that we have, recognizing also that as funders, we, in so many ways, we hold power, but we're also, so for example, like AWDF receives funding, and also we are a fund. And those kinds of positions come with the responsibility to continually reflect on what privilege that we have, and how do we use that privilege to be able to honor the people that frontline what we are calling movements and what we are calling the change that goes into, gender equality and wellness and healing and all of the things that we are working towards. I would love to stop here, but also just inviting all of us to say that this conversation that we are holding today is really a beginning of so many other conversations. And I think for us, it's from that angle that there is so much that's happening. I think we're in a world that we all agree, and it's defined differently, but in so many ways, I think at AWDF, it has been recognizing that so many places are on fire around us and even within us. And because of that, for us, solidarity comes with so many layers, that there are ways that we think about when do we show up actively. So whether we're physically there or virtually there, but also for us to critically take the decision to step back and to be able to honor whoever is leading, whatever it is, by actually giving them the space and the resources to be and to do what they're best placed. So we are in the space in all of that nuance, and really keen to listen, keen to learn. I mentioned that the AWDF plan isn't necessarily like a strategic plan that is like cast in stone, and that's partly why it's 10 years, which also means that a lot of the reflections that we have here today are things that we are able to actually go back and say, how do we integrate this in what we are doing to make sure that then we're delivering in a certain way. So we're really, really keen, intently, actively, and committed to utilizing whatever comes from this space to be able to shape how we continue to think about solidarity and care. Thank you so much. Back to you, Crystal.
Great. Thanks, Dina. Thank you so much for setting the scene, setting the context for this conversation. Lemlem is such a beautiful piece to read, and it uses the analogy of a garden, and it makes me think of a polyculture rather than a monoculture, different things growing in ways that they should be growing, in ways they know how to grow. You also use the word reflection and reflecting very many times, and it's clear that this space and the space that AWDF is in currently is one of reflection and opening up that space of reflection, which I think is very brave, to a wider space, the feminist community, women's rights organizations that you've gathered, for us to have an honest and careful conversation about how we work and how we move forward. So now I will bring Fadzai in, who I will give 10 minutes to take us through the strategy, the bolts and the nuts of how this work actually manifests in actual real work, and how you're envisioning it.
Thank you, Crystal. And hello, everybody. My name is Fadzai Mparuta. I work as the Solidarity and Care Specialist based in South Africa, born to Zimbabwe as my country. I identify as a feminist, but also as an anarchist, which are things that I hold really dear to me. And I think that ground me in the ways that I think about work, and the work that this particular stream is holding right now. In response to your question about the solidarity and care strategy, one of the most important things that came up for us when we were thinking about what this strategy would look like was based on feedback that AWDF received from feminist partners when we were thinking through and working on Lemlem. And it was very clear that our movements and our partners were tired. As Dina's mentioned, there are multiple crises that we're fighting. We're fighting them with limited resources in terms of people, in terms of money, our own capacity as human beings to hold the amount of work that we're doing. We're also very clear that there are a lot of marginalized communities that are working, and as they do the work that they're doing, they continue to be marginalized, even by feminist organizations, women's rights organizations. And so that continuously adds on to the amount of fatigue that they're experiencing. We also know and heard that there's increased NGOization of spaces, but as NGOs are cropping up, we're also seeing a shutting down of said NGOs. And I suppose while we're setting the stage for what is going on for activists, it's also really important for us to set the stage for a bigger context, right? Most of the feminists that we're working with, movement partners, activists, are working in an environment where we're fighting capitalism, imperialism, growing militarization and policing, evictions, genocides, food insecurity, starvation that's happening across the world. And so there's a multitude that's on the shoulders of the folks who are on the front line. And as we were given this task of crafting a strategy that was looking at solidarity and care, considering the amount of challenges that are there in the world, we were like, okay, so we have to be able to create a balance, right? Firstly, in acknowledging that there are challenges that are there, multiple crises that we're fighting, but also to acknowledge that in the fights, in the struggles, there's celebrations and joys that we are experiencing and we're taking on. And so as we started thinking about what we would be doing, one of the things that became clear to us was that in thinking about solidarity and in thinking about care, and in centering movements and in centering people, we would have to be creative. We haven't finished our creating. We're continuously doing the work of creating, imagining and dreaming. But where we've landed right now is an acknowledgement that solidarity is important. And I think Dina started speaking to it in terms of when we're showing up, how we're showing up. when we're taking a step back. This exercise and this process that we're in today is one where we're also saying we're stepping up, particularly because we don't necessarily get seen, and it's very intentional. The idea for us is that we're platforming the partners that we work with. They are taking on more risks than we are. And that's one of the things that also became really clear for us, was that as we think about risk, then we have to then think about the care, because that's where it's at, right? Like, then you think about the solidarity. So we're here to give. There was something Dina started speaking to around the landscape of funders, and important for us is an acknowledgement that funders and philanthropy in and of itself is based on capitalism. It's based on exploitation, it's based on extractivism. And so as a feminist organization, when we think about how we are doing things differently and how we want to do things differently, we're thinking about how we give money differently as well. And we can talk about it in terms of resources, be it tools, be it whatever technical support that we give our partners, but at the root of that is money. When people think about the things that are impacting their lives and the reason why their lives are impacted in the ways that they're impacted, it's because of money. And it's because it comes from capitalism, right? Like, we're exploited, we're not getting paid enough. We're living in areas where we have been moved to the margins of our countries or of our cities. It takes us a long time to travel to work and things like that. We also know that we're living in a world where most of the times, the countries that we live in, our money has no value. And so our role as solidarity and care is to give resources. We're redistributing the money that we get. And the ways we're thinking about the redistribution of funding, of money, is based on a couple of things that I think are different from how AWDF used to work before Lem. And importantly is giving resources to individuals. So oftentimes, organizations would apply for a call that had been put out. What we're doing right now, and as is the case with many other programs within AWDF, program streams, is that we have been given pots of money, and through those pots of money, we're encouraging folks to apply to various work streams that speak to them. So what we have right now is agency and resilience, solidarity and care, impact and learning, knowledge and voice, and resourcing in its entirety. So each team has a pocket of money that they're able to resource to individuals to do the work that they're interested in doing, the work that contributes to what we understand and see as liberation, and which is what is also grounding the work of solidarity and care. It's this idea that the work that we're all doing is setting us up for liberation, right? We're all seeking freedom. And so those are the ways in which we're thinking about and doing the work that we're doing. As we do this work, there are obviously parts of the work that continue to be set in the ways that they used to be. For example, we have flagships. And what we consider our flagship work is we have two flagship programs. We have the African Feminist Forum, which we are actually in the process of re-energizing, revitalizing. There's a whole process that we're embarking on for the next 2 years. And we're going to speak a lot more to that as we continue to have these engagements with folks. We also have the Flourish program, which really is about taking care of feminists who are working on the front lines, ensuring that they have a space in which they can come, rest, rejuvenate, recuperate. And we as AWDF are taking care of them in that exercise of getting back into themselves. But it's not just getting back into themselves, it's also a space in which to think about their lives going forward and how best AWDF can support that and how solidarity and care can hold that space. And the reason why this is important for us, and the reason why we've put it down as part of the work that we're doing towards care, as I was talking about money, is that we know that a lot of activists, and I speak about this as someone who was in the activist space for many, many years. We work where we hardly ever have enough money that allows us to think about life after work. We will work until we drop, right? And it feels like we're actually working towards our own oblivion because we're working every day. There is no cutoff time. There is no saying, this is a 9 to 5 job, because after 5, the world has not stopped turning or burning. And so part of what we're thinking is what it looks like to support our partners beyond where they're at now, to think about what beyond activism, beyond being on the front line, beyond working looks like, and supporting their work and holding their work, which is part of our accompaniment program. And as I was saying, we're really interested in ensuring that monies that we get within AWDF as an organization, but that gets passed on to solidarity and care moves. We have a project within the program that's called Moving Money. And that Moving Money part this year is sitting for solidarity and care was at about 480,000, if I'm not mistaken. I could be really wrong right now. And the intent is to ensure that we're able to move it to activists. Activists who are in organizations, activists who are individuals. In the past 3 months, we've been able to move that money to Francophone partners who want to do flourish work, but also looking at activists who are involved in advocacy and art. And so we're really open to people who are coming or who will come to us with the ideas of what it is that they're interested in doing, and for us to be able to support the kind of work that they would like to do. Important, I guess, in this conversation is also an acknowledgement of the partners who are going to be speaking today, who have been working with solidarity and care for the past 2 years. And the invitation to come into this space was to the partners to speak to what that experience has been like for them, but also to share with us what it would mean to do things differently. So this is really an opportunity for us to listen, to hear from partners, and to make sure that what we're doing is better. We do better by the folks that we're working with and who we are in partnership with. So that's really it for me. We're here to foster relationships. We want to build relationships. We want to build healthy relationships. We want to make sure the folks that we're working with are finding healthy ways of being in the world, and that we celebrate them along the journey and every step of the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fatsai, for taking us through that in a way that has come alive in the way that you presented also. So really appreciative of not having a very, PowerPoint with boxes of things in that conversational way. I can really feel the balance of the change that you're trying to bring in. You talked about AWDF stepping up, and I think this is a showcasing of that stepping up, of opening space to have honest conversations rooted in care. Money is a big thing. We've been thinking about money a lot as NAWI and wondering what life would be and what choices we would make if money wasn't a consideration. What work would we all be doing? Funding individuals is also something that really sparked my interest. So many times the fight for liberation is seen as only going through institutions, and we know that's not true. And so what that looks like, I'm interested to see. But also broadening the idea of wellness, looking at very practical things like healthcare and pensions, and looking at what innovative ways we could have access to pooled, negotiated, collective health insurance spaces and pension funds for activists to help them secure a little bit of safety. We know what it's like to work in the spaces that we work in, how dangerous it is, and how expensive and just lacking access to healthcare, for example, is. So looking at what that could look like in conversation is also something we've been thinking about at NAWI. I'll open up to conversation now, and I'll start with Aaliyah. I'm going to check if I'm pronouncing her name right. And she's been working, on Know Your African Feminist series in 2023. And really, the work of storytelling, of narratives is so important in the work that we do, pushing this idea that analysis, that the work can only be done through numbers, through quantitative analysis. And feminists have been pushing back against this for so long. So Aaliyah, I'll welcome you to also introduce yourself as you come in, who you are personally, where you're based and where you're calling in from, how you identify politically and professionally, what you do. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you today. It's going to be a lovely time. My name is Aaliyah Ibrahim. I'm speaking to you from Kaduna, Nigeria. Personally, I identify first and foremost as an artist, and I'm a multidisciplinary artist, a polyvalent artist. It means I work across valences and ideas and streams of thinking. Professionally, I'm an international development practitioner, and I'm always thinking with gender and resilience and what those two things mean in relation to each other. And then politically, I identify as a decolonial African feminist, which means I'm interested in the ways in which the colonial encounter shaped our understanding of gender relations and power. And so that's me. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Great. I'll also ask you to share a little bit about the work that you've been doing and the storytelling work and what your experiences are as we begin a conversation.
Okay, yeah. So my most recent relationship with the Solidarity and Care team is, like you said, stationed with the Know Your African Feminist series. It's a series that has been ongoing over the last decade and in different iterations and formats. The most recent iteration, which is the one I'm working on with, it's ongoing with the Solidarity and Care team. We decided to take what is generally the goal of the series has always been to create space for African feminists to reflect on their lives and their politics, and therefore be in conversation with each other and the constituents they serve. In the most recent iteration of the series, the goal was to take that kind of conversational idea and put it in a narrative format. And so we're going to hopefully have an anthology by the time it's done and out there and accessible to all. And so, this time we were very fortunate to have 10 fantastic African feminists from all over the continent, share their stories of struggle, community, and love, and, bring it all alive together, right? And while working on the series this time, it became very clear to me that storytelling itself can support the ways in which African feminist movements are equipped, right? When I'm in conversation with an African feminist, it's so important to note the amount of generosity offered in terms of reconciling how to be an African feminist, how to live the life of an African feminist. And so I'm very grateful to be part of this conversation. It gives me a chance to, bring up some observations I had during the process, and engage with the team about their strategy of shaping, amplifying, and celebrating narratives of African feminists. What does that mean? Because African feminism, as much as it's a political ideology, is a practice that is lived. And in these narratives, we have to untangle how that is lived in these times. And so I'm very excited to be able to bring that part of the conversation to the table. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaliyah. I'll now move to Nana. I'll ask you to introduce yourself. And Aaliyah spoke about narratives, and everybody should know your work around bodily autonomy, sex and sexuality, the work that you've done around hosting Sexual Utopia 2 years running now. And I'll invite you to also bring into the conversation what is critical right now? What should we, and very honestly too, what should we be thinking about? How do we engage with funding, with philanthropy to do the work that we need to be doing? And I'll also invite you to be very, very honest as you speak. This is a learning session, and it only helps to shape the way forward.
Thank you so much, Crystal, and it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah. I also identify as an African feminist, a writer, a podcaster, a communications professional, a friend of AWDF, part of the AWDF family. You know, I used to work at AWDF myself, so it also feels really good to be in this kind of space. And the work that AWDF has supported me and others to do in the past 2 years has been to hold a space called Sexual Utopia. So just to give some background and context to that work, many years ago, myself and my friend Malika Grant started a blog called Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women. And it's a blog that still exists today. And it was a space and is a space for women to share their stories around sex, sexualities, and pleasure. And we felt the need for this space because growing up, no one ever told us anything about sex beyond don't do it. And really nobody said what's the it was, right? And so we felt like it was really important for us to create a platform where women could learn from one another about sex. And that's a platform that has grown and taken many different forms. And then a couple of years ago, I just had the feeling like, why are we still talking about sex in only small spaces? Why is this conversation only happening online, right? And why is it that I am now finding myself in a space where I can be at a large conference, for example, and I'm invited to speak on a panel about sex and sexuality, but that is just one tiny conversation, usually not on the main stage, in a small room, but that's actually the room that gets filled. That's the room that everybody wants to come to. And so that's when I had the idea for Adventures Live, and which is really about taking the conversations that we have on the blog into the physical world and having a face-to-face. And one of the ideas we had was we wanted to have communities organize festivals, right? Where we celebrate sex, where we talk about sex, where people learn new skills, you know, have workshops. It involves music, it involves dance, it's celebratory. And that's how Adventures Live started. The goal had always been that this would be a Pan-African event, that we would go to a country, spend 3 years there, right? So we really sort of embed ourselves there, grow with practitioners there, and evolve and move to another country. So the first 3 years of Adventures Live was in Ghana, and the last 2 years has been in Kenya, and this year will again be in Kenya. And for the last 2 years running, AWDF supported this festival, which was really, really important because guess what? A lot of funders do not think conversations about sex and sexuality are really important, especially when you're looking at it from a pleasurable lens as opposed to a lens of, you know, harm, for instance, right? And so talking about funding and what funders should support, I think it's actually important to create spaces for people to be joyful, right? I love the idea of Flourish for that reason, the Flourish Festival that you mentioned, Fadzai, because it is really important, I think, that even while we're doing the hard work of resisting, we are also creating spaces where people can be. It's why we call the festival Sexual Utopia, because our goal in the festival is to, at least for that moment, shape and time, create a utopia where people can be, people of all gender identities can feel free, where people don't experience discrimination, where, you know, there's lots of grass around, there's lots of space and time to relax, where you get to connect, where you can live in the world that we're all trying to create, even if it's for just a day or two. And hopefully that energy, you know, fuels you and keeps you going until the next festival or until the next stream in space. So that's really Sexual Utopia in a nutshell.
Thanks, Nana. I was speaking to someone at a meeting last week, and she was like, Nana's first blog got me out of the church. It's the first time that I looked at my vagina and like started wondering, what's going on and do people really do this? So thank you for all your work, and also your bravery and courage to do the work that so many people don't know how to do, but you just get it done.
And can I also
Nathalie.
just say that,
Yeah.
like, I am very privileged, right? Somehow I've been the face of adventures, but I really want to emphasize that it's been a community effort, right? But understandably, a lot of people have chosen to be behind the scenes because there is backlash, right? When you're a woman who speaks about sex and sexualities. I think my privilege allows me to do so without experiencing backlash because I've worked in feminist spaces for a long time, right? And so, yeah, I just want to acknowledge that it's been very much a community effort. There have been so many anonymous contributors to adventures who up until date I have never met, but they took adventures as like their home and spent like 8 years sometimes writing anonymously for the blog. And especially our first couple of festivals were organized by people from just different like backgrounds, just because maybe I called them up and said, hey, can you work with me to organize a festival? So yeah, I just wanted to speak to that.
Thanks, Nana. And questions around what does solidarity and care look like for people who choose to be anonymous and behind the scenes, as well as the people who choose to be on the front of the struggle like yourself. So I'll put that in a parking lot for us to think of and percolate as we go forward. But I'll bring in Nathalie now, who co-facilitated the Francophone Flourish Retreat. And I really love this idea of a flourishing retreat. Indigenous knowledge for healing and communities and care is something that is so many times looked over. Things that are ours, that we hold true to in the ways that we lived our lives, and leaning to wisdom of our ancestors and ways of life is something that is kind of a struggle to bring into workspaces. So I'm going to invite you, Nathalie. I can't see where you are on my screen because, oh, there you are. To also please introduce yourself, who you are, where you're based, what you do, and what you enjoy doing. And then I'll invite you to respond.
Okay, donc, bonjour tout le monde. Moi, c'est Nathalie Fanja Haaby. On peut m'appeler aussi Shanti Deva ou Nathalie Fanja. Donc, je suis psychologue clinicienne de première formation. Puis, au fur et à mesure, j'ai élargi avec une grande passion pour l'art et des activités artistiques. Du coup, je me suis formée aussi en tant qu'art thérapeute. Donc, c'est aussi un de mes outils. Puis, au fur et à mesure de mon cheminement, j'ai rencontré aussi le yoga, le Kundalini Yoga. Donc, j'enseigne aujourd'hui le Kundalini Yoga, et ce qui me permet aussi de venir aussi, d'avoir une approche en tant que thérapeute holistique, c'est-à-dire ne pas se tenir seulement à la question du mental qu'on aborde en psychologie, mais accompagner les personnes de manière plus large, beaucoup plus large sur tous les plans de l'être. Donc vraiment le physique, mental, émotionnel et spirituel. Et puis, donc voilà, je suis aussi, donc depuis quelques années, j'accompagne avec l'AWF, avec la République féministe et d'autres organisations, donc pour le bien-être vraiment des femmes à travers toutes ces propositions, tous ces outils que je peux proposer. Sachant que le Kundalini Yoga, certes, ça vient de l'Inde, mais dans les recherches, on retrouve aussi que finalement, c'est des formes de soins d'approche qui existaient dans toutes les aires culturelles, c'est-à-dire de considérer l'humain qui a le côté physique comme le côté spirituel, mental, d'avoir l'approche holistique en fait. Donc dans le yoga, on a le yoga égyptien par exemple, vous voyez, qui permet de nous relier aussi à nos racines et à toutes ces disciplines qu'on peut ouvrir pour notre bien-être. Donc moi, je vis au Sénégal et je suis actuellement en train d'avancer, de continuer à avancer par rapport à ce cheminement dont je vous parle déjà, et pour ajouter une autre dimension qui est la dimension de la nature. Donc, accompagnement au niveau physique, au niveau mental, émotionnel, au niveau spirituel et aussi avec le contact avec la nature. Parce qu'à mon sens, voilà, les humains actuellement sont aussi justement en souffrance du fait de cette déconnexion. Et à la base, dans les ères, quand on parle de précolonial, justement, de culture ancestrale, clairement, on parle d'un ensemble. On a une conception où l'humain fait partie d'un tout et l'humain est connecté à la nature, et l'humain est connecté au cycle et aux autres humains, aux autres êtres vivants. Voilà, c'est cette approche-là que je peux avoir dans mon travail.
Thank you, Nathalie. Oh, go ahead.
Je peux rajouter quelque chose? Je peux rajouter que en termes d'activisme, c'est vraiment à travers mon art que j'exerce mon activisme par rapport aux femmes et par rapport à l'environnement. Et après, en tant que thérapeute, que j'accompagne les femmes, et là, je me considère, je dirais, écoféministe, féministe africaine et écoféministe, puisque j'avais rencontré, étant en études en Europe, le féminisme. Je ne m'y reconnaissais pas, mais c'est vraiment au moment où j'ai découvert le festival de la République féministe que vraiment ça a résonné énormément en moi et que j'ai pu rencontrer cette communauté de femmes qui vont dans ce sens-là que j'appréhendais depuis un bon moment, c'est-à-dire de revenir aussi à l'ancestral, de revenir à l'approche holistique, de revenir à la solidarité et avant tout se guérir, que chaque personne soit garante de son bien-être, de sa guérison profonde pour pouvoir mieux rayonner, pour pouvoir mieux échanger avec les autres et construire de manière créative aussi, de manière consciente, éclairée, créative.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. I might ask you one small question. And for you, what do you feel is critical in the work that you do that links to the work of solidarity and care for the greater movement, for individuals in the movement, for collectives and initiatives in the space? What do you think is missing? What do you think there needs to be more work on, just from your experiences in the work that you've been engaging with?
Alors, c'est déjà la retraite, la Flourish retraite, par exemple, c'était quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Et c'est vraiment ce type de choses dont les femmes ont besoin, clairement. Après, c'est une forme. Évidemment, ça nécessite une certaine logistique. C'est une semaine complète. Mais vraiment, voilà, elles ont pu se retrouver, elles ont pu se connecter. Donc, à travers, ne serait-ce que les repas ensemble, partager des moments de danse, être régulièrement aussi dans le cercle, hein, une soirée autour du feu, la nuit à échanger, à aussi des rituels aussi sont très importants. On a fait par exemple un rituel pour ouvrir qui était où chacune est allée dans la nature, chercher des objets de la nature et elle avait aussi un objet à elle, un objet de pouvoir et chacune a posé sur la table et on l'a fait vraiment de manière en ayant pris un temps avant, d'être très méditative et de déployer chacune toute notre créativité et de vraiment le faire ensemble pour pouvoir poser quelque chose ensemble, pouvoir poser l'énergie et cette solidarité qui allait se développer dans ce séjour, dans cette retraite. On a eu aussi, voilà, toutes les sessions avec ma collègue d'aromathérapie, elle a fait du massage, donc il y avait tout le côté aussi yoga, oui, de la danse, la respiration, et avec un travail important aussi, quelle que soit l'activité qu'on a proposée, de présence, de développer la pleine présence et pouvoir être entendu, en fait, pouvoir accueillir. Parce que souvent, surtout quand on est activiste, on se dit, bon, allez, là, ça va pas, c'est dur. Non, mais allez, vas-y, courage, tiens bon, il faut y aller. Et c'est vrai qu'il faut y aller, mais comment on peut avoir aussi des espaces pour avoir le droit de dire, oh, là, ça va pas, j'en peux plus, et pouvoir déposer et juste être pleinement entendu, être pleinement accueilli et avoir aussi des outils pour transmuter. Parce que je pense que quel que soit ce qui arrive, il y a une possibilité de transmuter les émotions, mais ça se fait justement dans une bienveillance, dans un non-jugement et avec des personnes qui portent et qui peuvent permettre ce processus de transmutation. Donc voilà, c'était vraiment ce travail de se relier, de vibrer ensemble, de donner l'importance à chaque personne, chacune dans son énergie est importante et a quelque chose à apporter. De revenir dans le sacré aussi, hein. Quelque chose, ça c'est très important aussi. Est-ce que je peux vous lire quelque chose par rapport au sacré?
Sure.
Ok. Le monde n'est pas un problème à résoudre. C'est un être vivant auquel nous appartenons. Le monde est une partie de nous-mêmes et nous faisons partie de sa globalité souffrante. Tant que nous ne nous attaquerons pas à la racine de notre image de séparation, il ne pourra y avoir de guérison. Et la partie la plus profonde de notre séparation de la création réside dans notre oubli de sa nature sacrée, qui est aussi notre propre nature sacrée. Donc c'est aussi une écoféministe qui a écrit ça, qui s'appelle Llewellyn Bogan-Lee. Voilà, ce qui parle de ça aussi, de revenir au sacré. Tout est sacré, tout est lié.
Great. Thank you so much, Nathalie. And I'll ask you to also put down who wrote the piece so people can read it later in the chat. That would be really great. And reminds me, Lemlem, this idea of a garden, of a polyculture, of the idea that there are multiple ways to heal, to nourish our souls, to nourish ourselves, even with the work that we do. A few weeks ago, I had a really tough conversation with a funder, not AWDF, but I won't mention who they were. And Hope Chikudu, for those who know her, took me through a session on chakras, and I had no idea. And connecting with nature and your root chakra, and connecting with nature and feelings of being grounded were so interesting, but also gave me such comfort in that moment where I was just about to I quit and I don't want to do this anymore. So thank you so much, and really interesting to read the work of the person that you put in the chat. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce their name. Oh, sorry, I'm muted. I will turn to Buky now. Buky, please introduce yourself, who you are, where you're dialing in from, how you identify, and who you work with. And the work that you're doing also touches on convening and curating of spaces to have conversations with a plurality of people, but also really holding space for feminist conversations, and that can be hard. So for you, I'll invite you to also talk us through what's important for you. What are you struggling with? What are opportunities? What is their minimal support for? What do you need for this type of work to hold a space and continue to do the work? And what lessons would you be able to give? Buky.
Thanks, Crystal, and thanks to everyone who's gone before me. Hopefully you can hear me and my internet is not disappointing me today. My name is Olabukunola Williams, but everyone knows me as Buky. Really great to be here. I'm a feminist, an African feminist. I work for Akina Mama Africa. I currently live in Uganda, but I'm from Nigeria. Yeah, Aaliyah. And to others on the call. But yeah, so I'm claiming East Africa at the moment, but forever Nigeria in my heart, always. And I work on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And with my work at Akina, as Crystal has mentioned, our work within that unit in particular has been to support the convening of the Ugandan Feminist Forum. And that honestly really felt like a blessing and an honor, because as Fadai mentioned, I think with the African Feminist Forum, there's work being done to bring it back to life. But I think across the continent, many of us were jealous of the Ugandan Feminist Forum and the fact that they've been able to be consistent in holding that forum, and bringing different, groups of women together to have important and necessary conversation and to build solidarity and to build community. And one of the lessons from that has been that, of course, building community and building solidarity is not easy. But I think what I've realized more than anything in this work, no matter what work you're doing, I work in sexual and reproductive health and rights, and we're facing a lot of backlash right now. But I know within the women's rights space in general, there is a lot of backlash that's happening, but it feels specifically devastating and demoralizing, especially for those of us working on sexual and reproductive health and rights, in the ways in which the attacks keep happening. and what that means for the communities who are doing that work. But I think what it has taught me, especially with the passage of the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda last year, and because previous to that, with the Ugandan Feminist Forum, and of course, AWDF supports the convening of that, one of the big conversations around that was, how do we have feminist spaces where everyone is welcomed, where sexual and gender minorities are welcomed? There's a really difficult conversation that is being had in these spaces around what it means to have inclusive spaces. Because for a very long time, especially as African feminists and even feminists in general, have been having a conversation of the need for women-only spaces, for safe spaces, for brave spaces, to have conversations that are critical and important to us. But what does it mean to be inclusive, right? What does it mean to bring trans men or trans women into those spaces? What does it mean to bring gender non-conforming persons? What does it mean to bring persons with disability who are also queer into those spaces, women living with HIV, sex workers? How do we create a space not just for them to come and be part of it in a tokenistic way, but for them to come and feel welcome, feel seen, feel loved, feel appreciated, feel like they're a critical part of the movement, that if their liberation is not possible, then our liberation is not possible either? How do we create the space where they feel empowered, they feel connected, they feel like they bring so much to that space that that space wouldn't be the same without them? How do we create those kind of spaces? How do we have those conversations that are also welcoming to those who are just starting in their feminist journey? And many, as Jessica Horn reminded us, as the UFF we had many years ago, where most of us are coming in as wounded warriors, right? A lot of us come to our feminism or to our activism from a place of pain, from a place of horror, from a place of anger, for me, for rage, you know, and seeking liberation. And you often feel that, okay, maybe this is the place I'm going to find it, because this is often the first places in which we find the language to name what it is that we are seeing, where we get to name the pain, where we get to connect it, that it's not just happening to you, but it's happening to, you know, people who look like you or who might not look like you, but who are going through the same thing like you. And that you realize that it's not just within your family, it's not just within your community, that this is a structural and systemic problem, right? Where it gives you a deeper understanding of what power means, right? And also reminding you of what your power is. And I think that's what we are able to do within spaces like UFF. But at the same time, those kind of spaces can also cause pain. Because, as I said, a lot of us are coming to look for a safe space, and safety looks different for everybody. And security looks different for everybody. So you might want to come to a space where you don't want to see male presenting people in general, because that's what safety looks like to you. But how do we change that conversation where it's safety can look like community, safety can look like solidarity, and safety can look like care? And I think that has been the big lessons of how do we create those kind of spaces, and to realize that the religious fundamentalists, and I'm using fundamentalists specifically because I don't think it's all religious people who are against us, but the fundamentalists in particular, those who are white supremacists, those who want to uphold the systems like Fatsa was talking about in terms of capitalism, right? In terms of maintaining extraction, maintaining exploitation, ensuring that women continue to subsidize our economies, right? They want to make sure that we all are in this constant state of distraction, constant state of fighting and of struggle. That's often because we are fighting systems, the people we get to turn on is each other. We get to turn on each other. We get to then say, oh, you being lesbian is the reason why we're being attacked. You being out there, being loud and proud as a trans person or as a gender non-conforming person is the reason why we are being attacked, because you're out there. It's because you are saying sex work is work rather than it just being exploitation. That's why this is happening to us. That's why we're not being taken seriously. That's why we're not being understood. Or because you don't use these languages, or you don't use the right word when you're talking about this thing. That's why we're not moving forward as a feminist movement. Those West African feminists are constantly talking about food. You know, those East African feminists are constantly using the words intersectionality, you know, all of these things so we turn on each other. And so I think the big work that solidarity and care and why it's important for me is that the only ways we are going to be able to get through these divides is by building trust and real connection, because that's what we've seen work. Because when you then get to connect with somebody, not just on the basis of identity, but you connect on the basis of your humanity, of the struggle, of understanding that we are connected and this is a political struggle. And the only way we can overcome these powers that be, the only ways we can have gotten to this point that we have is because we built power within ourselves and with each other. We reminded each other of what we're doing together. And I think that's what we're trying to do. It's not easy. I'm going to be very honest. Some days I'm pulling my hair out of trying to figure out, like, how do we bring all of these people together for us to have those kind of very difficult, honest conversations, but do it with such love and such care that it is evident that it comes from a place in which we see each other. And it comes from a place in which, at the end of the day, it's all love. That can it come from that place? And that's what we're trying to create. And that's the conversations that we're trying to have, and also trying to show who the common enemy is, you know, and the reason why we're having this struggle, and the reasons that we have to fight for identity, and the reasons why we have to fight for the naming, as they say in the African Feminist Charter, that naming ourselves feminists is political, and why that is important, and why we should connect with each other. So I think, for me, that's the thing that we do. And the last thing I would add is that, for me, one of the ways I wanted to do that, or we wanted to do that at Kina, was that we decided that at the end of the year, we would have something called a healing festival. And, you know, it's not going to be a place where we're going to come and talk to you about donors or about SRHR or SGBV and things like that. All very important, all very critical. And we usually have in around 16 days of activism. But it's kind of a space for you to just come and we talk about different things, health, wellness, pleasure. We get a bouncing castle. We give gifts, you know, those kind of things, just for you to feel like you don't have to be on. You don't have to be, you know, playing that role. You just get to come and you get to be. And I think we need more spaces like that, because then it's possible for us to build friendships. It's possible for us to build trust. It's possible for us to build connections and to build community, because I think that has been the hardest thing in the face of all of these rollbacks and clashes and oppression. The heartbreaking thing about that is to realize that community is difficult to build. And so for me, at the end of the day, and I think that's the thing we all need to figure out how to do, is that solidarity is the work. Building community is actually the work. The work is not, oh, we were able to put legal frameworks in place. Yes, that's part of the work, but the work is the community that's going to do that. The work is the community that is going to stand up to oppression, like we're seeing with the protests of university students against Gaza, like we're seeing the Sudanese women who've been able to keep their communities going, like we see with women in Congo who've maintained solidarity to be able to keep their communities going in terms of peace and security. And like we've seen with the LGBTQI movement in Kenya, in Uganda, in Nigeria, who've been able to hold their communities together. So thank you.
Thanks, Buky. Thank you for that, and for the brave work that you're doing organizing in Uganda, especially now when this backlash, this I don't even know how the words for it, is happening and is sweeping across the continent. We're seeing it happen in Kenya. We're seeing it happen in Ghana. We know where it's coming from. We know how it manifests, and even then it continues to gain strength. But still, doing the work of solidarity building, making spaces as inclusive as possible, as safe as possible, is really the work. And it reminds me of Audre Lorde and her series of essays and speeches, Eye to Eye, Black Women, Hatred and Anger. And she questions, where does the pain go when it goes away? And this thinking about that in the spaces that we occupy and in doing the work, you know, causing each other pain isn't something that I think we need to open up. So thank you for that. I will now turn to Nyambura. And Nyambura, I'll ask you to introduce yourself, but you've also been hosting the Cabral Ecofeminist School, which was such a joy to see come up from just an idea into the fruition of an actual space for this. Learning from our ancestors, from that Pan-African past of us. And the critique from this is how that Pan-African, you know, that time, that immediate post-independence time, where things seemed to work so much better than they do now. But the critique around that space and that time didn't include identities that were really other than men. And anyone other than a man, identifying man, wasn't seen, wasn't heard. We don't know what their words are. And so wondering how you weave into the work that you do, and what liberation looks like, learning from our ancestors and taking into consideration that it wasn't just the work of men that brought us here. So I'll open up to you, Nyambura.
So that's such a poignant question today, because we know that this morning, the great Zarina Patel, for those who don't know, Zarina Patel was a wonderful feminist organizer, environmentalist, feminist, leftist, socialist, a woman who committed class suicide in the idea of Cabral, right? She cast her lot with the poor and the working class and the vulnerable, and she comes from a beautiful line of Indians and Goans from across, when you look at the history of this continent, when, the whole colonial encounter. And so she died this morning, or rather we received news that she died this morning. And I was, when I read the message from a friend when she sent it, one of the things I was thinking about is that, you talk about, Crystal, you talk about the question around memory. And I like to use this quote by Molara Gundip and Leslie, who says that African women must theorize their own feminisms, as well as Jackie Alexander, who says that we must become fluent in each other's histories. This idea that, there haven't been movements, there hasn't been any form of organizing, any concrete form of organizing, and what this silences in the archives mean for the possibilities for radical organizing at this particular point. But so the African Ecofeminist Collective, which is now called Ramani Collective, and Ramani because Ramani is a Kiswahili word which means maps, and we think of ourselves as feminist, Pan-African feminist cartographers of liberation, because we do need to map out what are politics of liberation, what are politics of resistance, what are politics of organizing, what are politics of solidarity and care actually look like in this particular historical moment, but not forgetting that we are also children of Sankofa. We are within the Sankofa tradition. We constantly have to look back, right, in order to think about the present, in order to go into this emancipatory future. But importantly for us, and I'd say that the last 6 months, personally for me, has been a very, a time of reflection and thinking. We are 6 months into a genocide in Gaza, a year into the war in Sudan, decades into the resource plunder extraction, and it's colonial in nature in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the economic inequalities, a new wave of structural adjustment programs on the continent, and especially the last 4 years, and, especially, Crystal, you know this better because you work within the realm of feminist economics, where everything is being privatized, whether it's water, you name it. It's basically everything is up for grabs. But for us specifically, and thinking about the term Ramani, feminist cartography of liberation, one, we sat, and I think about the politics of solidarity and care in that. Sometimes I'm not sure what it means, especially and I don't want to throw in like one of those like a stink bomb somewhere, right? And cause some confusion or what. I worry we worry about when solidarity and care become this, it's sort of like this thing that we aspire to, but actually removed from the wider metapolitic. So one of the questions we start with Ramani is, what is the political metapolitic of, the meta-narrative around liberation? Solidarity and care are part of movement building. They are part of organizing. But solidarity and care in and of themselves are not movements and are not social movements. The other thing for us to sit with, and it's very unsettling for us when we think about it, is that we use the term movement very, very loosely. We've really come to a point where any form of being together necessarily means movement. But the honest truth, and when you think about the political, economic, social, cultural, ecological crisis that we face on this continent, is that we are one removed from the memory of mass-based popular forms of movement building that are transnational, transversal in character, and importantly, that are distinctly anti-capitalist. This has been very clear, whether from the Cabral School, or when we called ourselves the African Ecofeminist Collective and now Ramani, because we know capitalism is antithetical to any form of liberatory praxis. So any form of solidarity work, any form of care work that is, disconnected from a radical idea of, we cannot exist within capitalism, that it's not just about fighting for public services. We're not simply fighting for food in our bellies. We're not simply fighting for hospitals and, public healthcare and whatnot. Of course, these are important. And of course, this is what we absolutely need. But the wider goal of a collective politics of liberation that is steeped, that is, anti-patriarchal, that is anti-capitalist, that is anti-imperialist. And it's anti-imperialist because it allows then, those of us who are in Kenya, those of us who are in South, it allows South Africa to put a case before go to the ICJ. Because, this internationalist idea of how we are, it brings basically, it is the flesh, and the skeleton also of what an idea of Ubuntu is. So for us, this has been very central in our work, but also in terms of our thinking. And one of the things also that I've sat with, especially the last few months, and there was in Kenya, I've seen someone write in the chat box around the organizing around femicide, which is not just a problem in Kenya, it is a problem across this whole continent, right? But the question again of building the work of building movements, not just mobilizing, because a lot of the work we do is at the stage of mobilizing, and not that mobilizing is not important, but when people go to a protest, 10,000 people, which political homes do they go back to? Do you have the energy of 10,000 people on the streets, right? And then, we're incapable of, how do we organize with market women? How do we organize, with workers in Kenya right now? Yesterday I saw a minister basically wants to put forward a bill in which everybody, people, work in terms of contract work, no longer permanent and pensionable work. Of course, it's not just a crazy minister. It's part of the whole IMF World Bank idea around labor. It's a bigger politics around labor. It's not just one crazy person or one government that wants to attack labor. It is an ideological project of the right, right? So how do we organize? Where do people go at the end of the day after we've protested against femicide? Where do we go after we protested against a polluting mine? And these are the political homes that feminists on this continent have to get very, very serious about building. It's not just about a day of meeting. It has to be a constant space of, this is my home, this is my political home. So it's not just every 2-3 months that I end up, right, on the streets. That is important. But if we cannot think about an idea of, the transnational form of organizing, that workers, and also cross-class, organizing, one of the things that perhaps, one of the things that actually worries me, and it's part of, like, as I've been thinking the last few weeks about the conception of solidarity and care, is the silences that exist around class. And within feminist politics, where class seems to, it's sort of like we are all women or we are all queer, and class no longer exists. The question around the interplay around class position, class as a relation, the politics around indigeneity, the politics around location, geographical location. What does it mean to be surplus labor, living in informal settlements in Nairobi, in Johannesburg, in Kampala, in Lagos? What does it mean to be a poor peasant farmer in rural areas, assaulted by multinational corporations such as Monsanto, Syngenta, assaulted by, the laws and regulations being passed by the state? So even reclaiming that, the idea, not just reclaiming the idea of class, but a politics that is attentive to class, in the context of solidarity and care. So solidarity and care for me are parts of movement building. This is how I consider it. And we don't know how solidarity looks like until we organize. That is the other thing. Because there's the idea that we're doing solidarity work, but you cannot do solidarity work unless you're part of, movement building, part of organizing. Because solidarity around legislation being passed in Uganda, right, criminalizing human beings, looks vastly different, right, when you're talking about, extrajudicial killings in Mathare, in Nairobi. And also just that, what does solidarity actually mean concretely, right? It doesn't look the same. Care doesn't look the same. The context is important, not just the social context, but the political context, the economic context, both locally, regionally, and internationally, because this continent continues to be a site of extraction, whether it's through labor, whether it's through resources for the global north, the west, and multinational corporations. So I guess for me, one, as I conclude, is we need to trouble the concepts around solidarity and care a bit more. Two, we have to have a guiding meta-politic, guiding ideological projects. Solidarity and care are not ideological projects. They are a manifestation of a world we want to be part of and see, right? Because the right does solidarity very, very well. It's the reason why they are funding all these churches across the continent, Pentecostal churches. They know how to do solidarity. They know how to do care very, very well. So solidarity and care are not specific to the left or those of us who believe in liberatory worlds. We have to take very seriously what a guiding, liberatory, ideological project is. When we think about what Cabral was fighting for, when we think about Winnie Mandela was very clear that socialism, is a project. Capitalism is antithetical to the liberation of Southern Africa, right? So even just that, when we go back to, the radicals of the past, when we go back to what could have been, and we think about the possibilities of what can be, and guiding ideological project is important. How the form and the content looks like across the continent and across various issues, that's something very different. We leave it up to the very praxis of liberation and solidarity that we see. And the final thing I'd like to say is that, and it goes back to sort of how I started, we have to reclaim, we have to reimagine popular and mass-based organizing with a lot of love and respect to the feminist funders everywhere. We cannot decolonize funding. We cannot. I will not get into it right now, but to decolonize funding means that we live in a world where we do not need funders. We do not need aid. We do not need donors. And I get very vexed, I'm not going to lie, when people talk about we are decolonizing aid, we are decolonizing funding. And I know for those of us who are on our side, we come from it from a very good, good side, good path. But then it's sort of like forgetting what, the non-governmental, I'll call it an industrial complex, the structure that forms it. And it doesn't matter whether we do good or not, because we do a lot of good. But for me, the project is not to decolonize funding or decolonize feminist funding. The project for me is to live in a world where we do not have to ask for funding, that we have public services, we have the commons. This is the grand political project for myself as a feminist, as an eco-feminist, and as someone who loves this continent very, very much. So what does popular mass-based organizing look like? And for those who are here, where do people go? Where do 10,000 people go after they have been on the streets of Nairobi or Johannesburg or Cape Town? We have to reclaim kitchen tables. We have to reclaim organizing in markets. We even have to reclaim organizing in churches and mosques, right? However they are, we must take the battle to wherever the spaces are. So just that, because if we do not reclaim popular mass-based organizing, we'll be forced to constantly respond. And unfortunately, because of the way the world is structured, we'll be constantly forced to respond within projects and programs. But we have to respond, in a much, much more different, and not just different. I like to call it, I like to say this, the other side must start becoming threatened by us. They're not threatened enough. The fact that a minister can say that everybody's going to be in terms of like, no more pensions, no more what? They're not afraid of us. It's because they're not afraid of us that they think that they can do whatever the hell they do. We must start terrifying power. And by terrifying power, it is those sites of organizing that we must reclaim and we must reimagine. Yeah, so.
Nyambura, thank you so much. I could have listened to you for a very long time. Thank you for being so succinct.
Sorry, just one thing. I love what Buky has said, because I actually taught a class, and this is the June Jordan poem. We must become a menace to our enemies. They must be terrified of us.
Thank you, Nyambura. Yeah, being a menace to our enemies, and what does that look like? And what does that look like in ways that are collective, in ways that across class, which you rightly put is something that I feel we still need a little bit more work unpacking of, strategies of doing, examples of how it's done, borrowing from what was done previously, but also recognizing that the work grows in the way that it moves, and how do we grow it in ways that are safe for everybody. I really like the idea of a meta politics in the work, and the work of theorization of all of this is so needed. So I'm going to also invite people to put comments, questions, both in the chat, but also in the mirror board. It's been such a rich tapestry. I'm going to call it a tapestry of conversation, of ideas, of challenges, of points to think about, points to open up, challenges to philanthropy. What is decolonized philanthropy? Nyambura, this is a question that I've heard you question a lot of the time, and it seems like a counter statement in and of itself. But what does it look like to raid those imperial coffers and do the work of liberation? And what does that liberation look like? I think is something that we will be opening up. I'm going to start off with some comments, and I'll invite our panelists. I'm not sure if to call it panelists, but those that have shared space and conversation. And with AWDF as well, you're in the hot seat a little bit here too. And the first comment really is learning how sometimes we do not mean to harm our allies, but may find ourselves actually causing pain and anguish, even as we're stretching out a helping hand. Well-intentioned, but how it lands is terribly painful and actually ripping apart solidarity, unity, the ability of working together, rooted in care. So that's the first question. The second comment is somebody struggling, and she says, I think it's, yes, trying to create a young feminist movement in Ghana that has everyone recognizing and reconciling our differences, and at the same time presenting a solid front in our fight against patriarchal systems has been exhausting. I give up almost every day. And I think everybody on this call feels what that feeling is this feeling where you just, want to just put it down and walk away, and we still keep coming back. Class violence is another comment, has become an imposed form of intimacy in feminist organizing. To build solidarity and care, we have to center refusal of capitalism's conflation of intimacy and love with money and systems of extractive resource production. So I will open up, I'll take those three, open up to everybody, both the AWDF team on the call, if anyone feels like something that you'd like to contribute to, but also Nyambura, Aaliyah, Nathalie, Buky. Is there anything that you would like to comment on, give some ideas towards from those three comments?
Yeah, I would like to really, kind of bring it back to this question of storytelling and the kinds of stories we tell ourselves about why we're grieving, why we're mourning, why we're happy, why we're sad, and how those stories play into the moments that are actually open for transformation. Because I think ultimately solidarity and care is just one story we're telling ourselves about what we need, right? And when, I'm talking with African feminists and I'm talking about their lives and the fabrics of their lives, and I'm, asking questions, how do your ideas change? What were you thinking 5 years ago that you're not thinking today? The thing that keeps coming up is this willingness to shift and bend within their narratives, right? And I think the idea somehow that solidarity and care comes into the movement, versus it's outside of the movement. These are all questions of what kinds of stories are convenient for us that might not be convenient anymore. And especially, when we think about the kind of conditions we are in of the present, right? Where sometimes it can feel like your politics is in, somebody made a comment about, oh, it's so hard for me, right? It's so hard for me to organize young feminists. It's so hard. We have to untangle so much every day within what we're doing while moving towards the world we want. For me, when it comes to solidarity and care, there's this question of narrative, but ultimately within the question of narrative, there's this question of how do we do this thing of living and loving at the same time, right? How do we combine something that feels impossible, these contradictions, how do we inhabit them? And one of the things I keep thinking about is this question of funding individuals, right? And if African feminism, how does African feminism inhabit the conception of the individual, right? Where does the individual lie in African feminism? Do we progress the politics of individualism at all? And so when I think about the stories of people, when I'm doing the African feminist series, I'm not saying, oh, I'm knowing one person, right? I'm saying I'm knowing a person within their context, within the scale of the self and how the self evolves over time. And so the biggest thing that comes to me again and again within the question of the narratives of solidarity and care is our willingness to learn, our willingness to bend and shift, our willingness to overturn one story and take up another story, and what I would say, like almost the rapidity of that storytelling, because I think sometimes we say a story, we change it like a little bit, just a sentence and a paragraph, and we say it again and we continue with it. And so the scale of that kind of change within narratives of progress, narratives of change, how fast we want it, right? And I think one of those places is if we can question what it means to be an individual, what it means to be a movement, where those things meet, and ultimately where solidarity and care enters, whether it's with, externally, it's coming in from, somebody giving you money, or it's coming in from within, how you guys redistribute resources in the group. And so that's something I'm really thinking about, is the stories we tell, how fast we change the stories we tell, and how willing we are for those stories that we tell to change with us as we're changing. Yeah.
Thanks, Aaliyah. I'm opening up to see if anybody else, Nana, Nathalie, Buky, Nyambura, Fadzai, Dina, Shame.
So I think maybe what I'm going to add really is one about the issue of time, because I think that also within our spaces, one of the hardest lessons was that things like this don't happen overnight. that the work is about being consistent, about finding ways of also, you know, sharing the burden so that you're not the only person taking it on, as well. And also figuring out, you know, your investments, because the truth is the work is hard. Dealing with human beings, even within your families, within your household, is just a difficult process. Being friends with people is a difficult process. So bring it into the fact that you all come with different ideologies, different feminisms, different understandings, different trajectories, different things that you're passionate about, and are trying to connect the dots and to trying to find alignment and to find ways to connect with each other. I think that has been the difficult part of it. But I think that more than anything else for us, and especially because we're also doing it within this industrial complex, as Nyambura mentioned it, where we are trying to seek visibility, where we're seeking money, where you need to be able to say, I'm the convener, I'm the one who created this movement, I led this movement, give money to this movement, and all of those things. And it makes it difficult to be able to share and to be able to, you know, build something that is horizontal rather than vertical, rather than hierarchical. So it's really about then, how do we do that? How do we do that? How do we unlearn things that we've learned and relearn what it actually takes to do the actual movement building, like Nyambura was talking about? How do we raise consciousness? Because I can't say that I learned all of these things magically when I, you know, became a feminist. Like, I knew all of the things that I know now. It was a journey. It was a consciousness raising process. I learned from others, either my age or from those whose shoulders on which we stand, you know, reading the literature, getting access to information, being able to participate in workshops, schools, different things like that, that made it possible. So how do we create more spaces for that? How do we ensure that that happens? And I think that's the work that you're doing. So I completely understand why it can feel frustrating, why it can feel like it's hard. But one, I think, is dividing the work. Two is spending time. And three, realizing that we do need to invest in consciousness raising, because that's part of what gets you to the point where you realize that this is important.
Thank you, Buky. I see Nathalie and Dina, and as I ask them to come in your answering, I'll also ask you to shape it around how you see feminist institutions and also individuals. How should we be pushing solidarity and care forward, and really embedding it in the work, as we answer some of the comments that have come up?
Oui.
Oh, Nathalie.
Je peux intervenir, ok. Oui, donc déjà, par rapport à ce qu'on a pu faire dans le cadre de la Flourish Retreat, c'était par exemple que les personnes qu'on a reçues, qu'on a accompagnées, les femmes, les participantes, sont des femmes leaders qui accompagnent aussi des communautés. Donc l'idée, c'était un moment pour elles, mais c'était aussi beaucoup de transmission, c'est-à-dire quels outils aussi on peut leur transmettre, c'est-à-dire apprendre à mieux respirer, à mieux gérer ses émotions, apprendre à encadrer un groupe, à justement créer cette solidarité. Donc, il y a la transmission. Il y a aussi comment justement chaque personne individuellement au quotidien met en place des rituels pour quelque part rester centrée par rapport à tous les défis qu'elle peut avoir à relever. Je ne sais pas si vous avez déjà vu ces expériences-là, mais parfois, des personnes qui ont des avis très différents, voilà, peuvent rapidement se disputer, rentrer en conflit. Une expérience a été faite de, par exemple, mettre deux personnes face à face et se regarder sans parler pendant plusieurs minutes. Et généralement, ce qui arrive, ce sont des larmes. Donc, c'est comment on va pouvoir introduire aussi des outils, c'est-à-dire dans des réunions pour créer un mouvement, comment on va introduire des outils pour se connecter, pour se centrer et pour avoir une communication qui soit voilà, d'une grande qualité et pour pouvoir le faire en ouvrant notre cœur, quelque part. L'autre chose qui me venait aussi par rapport à ce qui a été dit précédemment, c'est l'importance d'avoir aussi des lieux qui soient autonomes de plus en plus. Parce que, par exemple, on peut faire une retraite et puis se retrouver dans un lieu qui est finalement très voilà, corporatif, géré par par le patriarcat. Donc, on revient à cette question en parallèle, par exemple, quand on parlait de financement, vous voyez. Donc, c'est comment aussi, en commençant petit, les femmes se réapproprient, c'est-à-dire la terre, des lieux, de la culture, parce qu'à la base, les femmes sont gardiennes de la vie, sont gardiennes de la terre. Aujourd'hui, même la question des semences a été accaparée par le capitalisme. Donc, c'est déjà comment le premier espace de liberté, d'autonomie, peut-être on le développe à partir de là, à partir du lien à la terre, d'être autonome au niveau de la nourriture, de l'énergie et tout ce qu'on peut déployer ensuite après cela. Voilà,
Thank you, Nathalie. Dina.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just wanted to speak about a reflection around, for lack of a better way to phrase it, cleaning our own houses, like being committed to the discomfort of reflecting from within, as a way of enabling ourselves, but also taking in what's coming in terms of what are we listening, and for us to be able to use that to rethink what it is that we are offering, but also the ways in which we show up. And for example, on the question of young feminists, and I hear you, Benewa, I don't have any solution, but what I wanted to reflect is also that there are very difficult times. And I think last week or just recently, there's been information, for example, around defunding Frida, for instance, which is the Young Feminist Fund, but also different young feminist groups across the continent continually struggling to access funding, to access resources, to access spaces, for them to be able to be in community with each other, but also to connect with other communities. And I think it's a critical reflection and issue that is important for us to continue thinking about, but also being more actively committed towards the shifts that we are able to make, to be able to address, because it's also not really like a fund, and I'm not really speaking as AWDF. I guess there is a space to say, okay, I'm speaking like AWDF, but as part of different communities as an individual. And so for me, it's as Dina in this space and what we see and what we connect with and hear. And as a feminist, I'm no longer young, I clocked 37. So sometimes I'm like, I'm not the young feminist in Uganda, but being part of different groups of young feminists within like the Kampala streets and the people that are fighting in the front lines to organize, and the continued denial for them to access the things and the tools that they need to be able to deliver much needed change. And I think it's also a call for us to be more honest, you know, in terms of, because also there are ways in which we think about solidarity from the angle of co-creating and building intergenerational spaces and conversations, and being able to, you know, foster that to happen. And unfortunately, sometimes it's more like the older generation is like building these spaces and inviting younger generations to, you know, engage in. And it's more like that very linear top-down mentorship kind of approach, which does not necessarily foster learning that draws from, you know, across groups. And so for me, I think it's a very critical one. For AWDF and Lemlem, I would like to note also that in Lemlem, there is a bold commitment to resourcing girls and adolescents, which is something that is also boldly new in terms of how AWDF is you know, presenting ourselves over the next 10 years. And I think for us, that's a big one, because we've traditionally been known as, resourcing women, and by women really being 18 and above and all of that. And I think these are opportunities to continue. Again, I'll go back to the word reflect, because they're new spaces. And I think solidarity is also around the humility to learn from groups that are already leading this. So partners like the African Girls Fund in Kenya, for instance, the Global Fund for Children, Purposeful, and others, and really seeking out partnerships and being able to enable relationship, learning, community, but also that they have built networks and they're able to reach more in terms of comparative advantage. Yeah.
Thanks, Dina. Buky and Nyambura, you opened up a box of what terrifying power looks like. So I'll start with Nyambura, and weave in a different question. Somebody asked, how do we go beyond organizing for a movement? How do we nourish the feminist organization to make it a movement of fearful power? So there's a couple of questions there. What does terrifying power look like? How do we build a movement of fearful and, I guess, terrifying power? And because I've also watched you organize so flawlessly cross-class, how do we manage in practice to decenter money in a capitalist world where the people who form the feminist movement are poor people who struggle to survive inflation and the deplorable social problems of their communities? So how do you invoke fear when people are struggling to put food on the table? And what does a terrifying, powerful movement looks like? So I'll start with Nyambura, pass on to Buky, because the both of you invoked the idea of terrifying fear. And I can see Fadzai's hand up, so I'll also then move to her. So Nyambura.
So first of all, since Buky put it out there, it's a poem by June Jordan, and it's called Must Become a Menace to My Enemies, and it's in honor of Agostinho Neto, who was called the People's Poet. And if you know about Agostinho Neto, he was one of the anti-colonial leaders in Angola. And if you read through the history, you see this African-American woman in solidarity and writing this beautiful poem about Agostinho Neto that already speaks to her political commitments as a poet, as a cultural worker, that her poetry, that the work that she does is transnational, internationalist in nature and anti-colonial. But I'd love you to read it. It's so beautiful, especially the last, I think they're called stanzas, the last two stanzas. But when you talk about terrifying power, in my life, it's not too long, but I've also lived. I've been in spaces where we have actually fantasized about starting to beat, the whole thing about normalized beating up politicians and whatnot. So I've spent quite a bit, I'm not saying that you do that, but I've spent a lot of interesting time fantasizing about one of the ways to terrify power, especially when you're like, what do we actually do? So I want to, before I get into that, I want to say one thing. And it's a question that has come up in the chat about what do I mean? Because I think it is directed at me, because that is what I said about power. A lot of feminists are actually afraid of power, or rather the ways in which we think about power. It's often presented as, we are fighting against oppressive power. But the reality is this: if we don't figure out, the point is power, the point is to take power, the point is to transform power, because they're right. The homophobes, the transphobes, the people who want to kill us, the people who want to enslave us, people who want to take the poor and the working class from across Africa to go and work in slave-like conditions in the Middle East, right? They have power. What's his name? Kwame Ture said something. He has a quote that says that, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. But if he has the power to lynch me, then that becomes my problem. See? You can, as long as someone has the power to radically destroy your life, then it becomes a problem. We need to figure out how to radically have power, the kind of power that not only protects us, that not only ensures that whether it is corporations, whether it is the state, whether it is politicians, can absolutely not wreck our lives. And you do that by organizing. You do that by movement building. And one of the things I must say, to be very, very clear, and I say this to speak to those of us who are implicated in, who work in NGOs or who do funding, and I'm part of that ecosystem. So this is also a critique of myself and the ways in which I exist. You can't fund movements. That is a fundamental, misunderstanding of what social movements are and movements are. You can support by resourcing components of organizing and components of movement building. But social movements in and of themselves, social movements that think about emancipation and liberation, that is where decolonization happens, not the funding that we provide to oil the components of organizing, whether it is to provide safe houses, whether it is to ensure that, like now what we have in terms of the floods in Kenya, that people in Mathare, are able to stay warm for the next few days or the next few weeks, because clearly the state in Kenya has decided that they don't care. People can die, they can get flooded, they can get bilharzia, cholera, whatever it is. This is what radical resourcing can do. But when we get to the aspect of social movement, that is where the power is. But we can continue to build power by organizing. And that is what I was saying earlier, that I see solidarity and care not as the destination, but as a process of building the kind of radical power that we need to shift the balance. So that is basically what I can say. It is movement building. That is exactly how you get to power. And feminists shouldn't be afraid of power. I'm not going to let anyone come to my house and kill me. Right? When we think about what the Black Panthers are doing, when we think about the anti-colonial struggles across Africa, these are people who have decided that we cannot live as slaves of the colonizers. But then you organize towards that. NGOs, funding, feminist funders, they do support that work, but it is much more. And I'll end it with one thing. About a decade ago, for a number of reasons, I spent a lot of time with my mother and the women in her church. I won't explain why, but my presence there wasn't because of the spiritual aspect of it, was because of other reasons. But, Yasmin Nair, who's a writer, some of you whose work you might want to engage with, she has an article, an essay, which says that the left needs to organize like the right. And I sort of disagree with the title of it, because the right learns how to organize from us. These ideas of care, ideas of presence, it's what we have lost in the last 40, 50 years of neoliberal globalization, right? And I remember 10 years ago, the kind of comfort, the kind of care that my mother's church group offered to each other, and they still offer it to each other 10 years later. Organizing is not a picnic. In fact, one of the things that I've had to painfully learn is that I don't have to like you to organize with you. Please, I'm going to tell you this. As feminists and as women, especially as women, for those who identify as women, it's okay to not like someone, but it's important that that we are committed to the political project. I don't have to like hanging out with you. I don't have to, want to hang out with you at the club or go to a pub with you, or have a, come to your house for drinks or whatever it is. It's fine, as long as it's not, as long as it doesn't get to the level of I need to destroy you. That's fine. But the political, because I feel like some of the interpersonal conflict, people are messy. People are really, really messy, right? Because of capitalism, because of how they've grown up. I remember someone saying that you meet someone as an adult, they have 32 teeth, right? They're fully formed. You don't know where they've come from. You don't know what their home situation like. You don't know what kind of crisis they deal with day in, day out, right? Sometimes we have to be very careful in the ways in which we engage each other at a personal level, right? As long as we are committed to a political project, And as long as sort of the rules of engagement are maintained, then I don't have to necessarily want to hang out with you every other weekend, right? And this is I would love to, because I don't want someone to misinterpret this, and I maybe I shouldn't have said it because I have a much longer, it's much more formulated in my head than here. So please do not misinterpret me. I'm not saying that people who want to harm each other should be forced to be. That's not what my central thesis about this is. But I think that the politics of organizing requires quite a bit of us, right? That, yeah, let me just leave it there. Let me just, because it's also very personal to me when I say that. But we don't have to, I don't have to want to come to your house on Saturday for me to believe that you need healthcare, that you need education. For me, that is the thing. That's why I started with a meta-politic. The meta-politic of liberation for me is not that I should be able to come on Sunday and stay at your house. My meta-politic for liberation is the commons. My meta-politic is an abolition of capitalism. It is a different world altogether. And let me tell you something. The more we think about the grander meta-politic of liberation, the easier it is to deal with the interpersonal conflicts and the intrapersonal conflicts that we have with one another. That should be the starting point, not this other way. The starting point of the conflicts that we have with each other every day is the problem. That is my own thinking from my own experience. Please do not misinterpret me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nyambura. And like most other things that have sparked up in conversation with you, I'm really looking forward to reading because I know you will be writing something about this. I have a feeling. And if you weren't thinking about it, here's a nudge.
Right. You're right. You're actually very
Exactly. Exactly. And the politics of being able to theorize and having ourselves to reference, am I still here?
Yes.
With this, I had phrased out the question before, so I won't repeat it.
Is that for me, Crystal?
Sorry, I'm breaking. He's going through flooding and the internet is terrible. I'll pass on to Buky. I had asked sort of a similar question on terror and fear before I hand over to Fadzai to close for us.
Yeah, I feel like Nyambura really covered a lot of it, but I do think that for me, when I think of being a menace to my enemies, it is that meta that Nyambura was talking about, in which that I do want politicians that when they hear the name feminists, or when they hear a certain group of people, you know how people used to be scared of trade unionists across the continent? That when they hear that the union is on their matter, people start to behave. You know what I mean? Remember back in those days, when the labor unions in our countries were proper labor unions, or when the student unions, before they were crushed by authoritarian governments, and they knew that students said, today, not today. That's what we mean, because they realize that you can mobilize, you can show up, you can destabilize their power, you can make them look foolish, you can make them look stupid, you can make them seem like, like they are not the ones who are making any sense. And I think that's what is very critical to us, because I think civil society in many ways used to represent that, and we're holding on to it. But in many ways, we've also lost credibility. That's just the truth. Civil society has also really lost credibility in being able to be a menace. We have, in many ways, kind of colluded with power, saying we're doing behind the scenes advocacy, which can sometimes be very useful. But I think the truth is they are no longer scared of us. They aren't. I remember when a lot of our, women were talking about Beijing, not all women made it to Beijing. There were some women that were stopped at the airport who were not allowed to fly, whose visas were seized, because they knew that if those women entered Beijing, it was over. Like they were like, this one's, no, they shall not pass. And so they stopped them because they knew who those people were. They knew them by name. They knew their ability to mobilize. Last, I will end because whenever I think of menace to my enemies, I think of Funmilayo Ransome Kuti. I'm Nigerian, I'm Yoruba. So Funmilayo Ransome Kuti is kind of the prototype for me when I think about organizing, because this was a woman who was trained by the colonial powers, but who, living in Nigeria, realized that, you know, women were being sidelined. And so she started doing tea parties where she was organizing with market women. She wasn't just organizing with women who would drink tea alone. She said, you know what, I need to start working also with market women. And they would have conversations. And out of those conversations, they realized that the ways that were being taxed were unfair. See, economic justice as well. Like realizing that the way they were being taxed was unfair. And so they decided to come together, and they decided that they were going to go talk to the king at that time. He's called the Alake. By the time they showed up, he had run away. He left when he heard that these women were coming. And even colonial powers were scared of them in terms of the way she would talk back to them, because they realized that this was a woman who could build a movement. And she was never allowed to enter the United States because of kind of the mobilizing power that she had. So I think when I think of menace to our enemies, it's that we must think of who do we owe accountability to? The accountability, is it to the government? Is it to your donors? Or is it to community? Because if we owe our solidarity and our accountability to communities, then people are going to be scared of us because we are not beholden to them. We're beholden to the community that we are with and that who we work on behalf of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Buky. I know we don't have very much time because this webinar space will shut. So I'm going to pass on to Fatzai now to give us a little bit of a reflection, just a little bit, but also to help us close, to help us understand what the upcoming sessions are, how we can continue to engage, how we can engage with the mural board beyond this, and basically what happens now and what space AWDF will hold for us. So thank you, everyone. That was such a wonderful, such a rich conversation. There's so many threads that are left undone, which is always a great place to be. And I have not been on a webinar in a while that has had so many love hearts and hand claps thrown up into the ether in a long time. So it's a really great energy.
Thank you so much, Crystal, and to everybody. Nyambura, Aaliyah, Buky, yourself, Crystal, Nathalie, Dina, and the folks at AWDF actually who have endured me over the past 2 months as we've been working to create this space. My reflections on what the space has been, what it has felt like, is an igniting of a passion that I think for a long time I have been missing in my life. I'll be first to confess, working in a donor organization is very limiting for someone who used to be pro, let's create an army and go get everybody. Let's create our own army, right? Let's rage. And having to sit back and hold myself and be like, you now sit in a very different position, and the position that you're in right now is to open up the space. And for those who want to go and burn, figure out how you support that work, right? How you contribute to that, how you contribute to a building of a politic, how you contribute to ensuring that there is space for such conversations to carry on happening. How I also go back to the directors, the people who source the funding and say to them, listen, we've just come from a discussion where people are saying we need this for this to happen. And what I'm taking back right now, what I'm sitting with actually, and not taking anywhere, what I'm sitting with and shaking as I feel through it is this idea of what it means for us to continuously organize and continuously building our political spaces, our political minds, our political processes, because that really is something that has been lost. Not that it's not there, it's we're not doing enough of that, and there are too few of us who have the space in which to do that. My commitment right now, which leads into what we're going to be doing next, my commitment and the commitment of the team that I work with is to say we are ready to provide funding. We're ready to have conversations around the kind of funding that people want to have for them to hold the spaces that they want to hold and to do the work that they want to do. We have nothing to do with it. We are in the background. And all we want to do is give it to you so that you can be and do the things that need to be done. So that's where we're at, that's where we're sitting, that's what we're thinking about. We're definitely, as Shema said at the beginning of this conversation, is gonna go through what has been put down on the mirror board. We're going to listen to this conversation and we are going to write about it because there has been a lot that came out and we want to be able to share it with everybody and in as many languages as we can share it, because that's the other thing that we're trying to do, is ensure that it reaches as many people as possible. And as we close the session, we have an upcoming conversation on the 9th, and it's part of our continued discussion around how we want to build relationships with people as solidarity and care. And so we're reflecting on lessons learned, missteps, and our commitments. We believe that it's important for us to come back to folks and say we have made some major mistakes, show them what those mistakes are, and the kind of work that we're doing to address those mistakes, and in conversation with the folks that we have made mistakes with. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. And I think it's one of those conversations, again, that funders don't necessarily have. We do not own up to mistakes. Solidarity and Care is saying we're going to own up to them. Because we're human, we err, and we want to be learning from those mistakes. So if you're available, see you all on the 9th. But for now, thank you so much for being with us, for holding the space with us, for sharing your thoughts and views with us, and being in this community that we're trying to build. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Merci.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.